within the valleys of Shinano province. They said the Takeda advance could not be stopped. Upon the vast Kanto plain, they said the foundations of the Go-Hojo would never be threatened. In the Hokuriku, as the mighty Nobunaga extended his control, they said the Oda would never be humbled. Now they say nothing. They feared him like a force of nature, and in time came to call him the Dragon of Echigo and the God of War. Throughout his nearly 50 years, he went by several names, yet today we know him best as Uesugi Kenshin. A figure larger than life, he has become known as perhaps the most unique, valiant, and strategically gifted daimyo of the Sengoku period. Let us explore the life of Kenshin and come to understand the man behind the legend, to discover what makes him stand out among the many storied commanders of his age. When looking back at history, it can be easy to paint with broad strokes, to know the big moments and how they shape our perception of the figures involved. Uesugi Kenshin has become one of the most well-known daimyo of Japan's Sengoku Jidai, its age of warring states. His life story becoming an epic tale of major battles and campaigns, with the backdrop of his deeper spirituality, wisdom, and virtue. It is because of this that, although he never achieved the greatest heights of some of his contemporaries, namely that of the three great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would truly be the ones to piece the country back together under a mighty new regime, Kenshin is still often held in just as high regard, if not higher. But what made Kenshin who he was? And how does what we know about his character influence our thoughts about his greatest achievements? Let us start at the beginning. He was born in 1530 in Echigo province, a son of Nagao Tamekage. In childhood, he would be called Torachiyo. Not being the eldest child, however, he would at some point be made to take up a religious life, being supposedly sent off to Rinzenji, where he would receive teachings from the sixth head of the temple, Tenshitsu Koiku. Thus, we can gather that from an early age, spirituality played a large role in Torachiyo's life. His father, Tamekage, head of the Nagao family, was himself a vassal of the Uesugi, and stories have painted the relationship between him and his son Torachiyo as perhaps a negative one. Yet, Tamekage's fate is unclear. While previously there was a belief that he may have died as early as 1537 while fighting against an uprising of the Iko-Iki in Kaga province, recent findings suggest that Tamekage may have instead lived into the 1540s. Regardless, through either death or retirement, his son Nagao Harukage, Torachiyo's older brother, succeeded him and became head of the Nagao family. Now, history has not been too kind to Harukage, as he is often perceived as being weak and perpetually ill. He was unable to fully quell conflicts within Echigo, and thus many under the Nagao banner began to look elsewhere for leadership. And the figure they began to settle on was that of his brother, Torachiyo. In 1543, Torachiyo had come of age, assuming the name Nagao Kagetora. Within 3 years, Kagetora had proven himself to be a competent military commander, working to crush the opposition within Echigo, all in the name of his brother. With more and more warriors rallying to Kagetora's side, tension began to arise between the brothers. This left Kagetora in an interesting spot: ignore the pleas of others and continue to fully support Harukage, despite whatever unstable times may lie ahead for the clan, or embrace the call to leadership for the good of the family and province. It was a question that no doubt must have plagued Harukage as well: submit to his brother's growing popularity, or maintain the course and contend with Kagetora. The issue came to a head in 1549, when Uesugi Sadazane, the Shugo military governor of Echigo intervened to mediate the situation. It was here, through delicate discourse between the parties, it was agreed that in order to refrain from violence and fracturing the family, Nagao Harukage would peacefully relinquish control of the clan to Kagetora. It must have been a decision that weighed extremely heavily on Harukage, but ultimately, he made what can be considered a correct decision by allowing his brother to take leadership, as through Kagetora's command, the Nagao, and subsequently Uesugi, would in time come to prosper. Now, it should be noted that while this version of events sees Harukage peacefully step aside, other sources have previously claimed that a larger conflict between the brothers had broken out within the province, leading to Harukage committing seppuku upon being cornered by Kagetora and his supporters. However, this does not appear to be the dominant theory any longer, especially seeing as how Harukage is believed to have lived until 1553. With Kagetora, it was not long before he became recognized as a dominant force, not just as the head of the Nagao, but soon enough within the entirety of Echigo province, with the passing of Uesugi Sadazane later in 1550. Yet, despite his rising status, Kagetora did not mean to assert himself over the Uesugi, at least not yet. For years, the Go-Hojo had contended with local branches of the Uesugi family, who were the rulers of the Kanto, yet had become weak and fragmented. As the Hojo campaigns continued to drive them back, Uesugi Norimasa came under threat. Norimasa was the prominent head of the Yamanouchi branch of the Uesugi family, and the Kanto Kanrei, the Bakufu-appointed deputy lord of the Kanto region. Kagetora, holding true to the Nagao family ties with the Uesugi, was quick to dispatch forces to aid in Norimasa's defense. Yet it would take far more in order to truly halt the advance of Hojo Ujiyasu, and by 1552, Norimasa had fled into the safety of Echigo. Still, we can learn a lot about Kagetora from this action of sending support to the Uesugi, as it can be questioned if sending support to an ally a province away was really a worthwhile endeavor, especially when Echigo itself was not completely stable. Still, Kagetora did so anyway, displaying a virtuous nature we will come to see again and again throughout his life. Now, to some of his retainers, this would have always been the Kagetora they knew him to be. Yet others may have been perhaps taken aback by this and other eccentric behavior Kagetora was said to have displayed. Stories say that Kagetora was not one to hide his emotions, but instead displayed them openly to those around him. These emotions no doubt being intertwined with virtues and values that had been ingrained within him throughout his upbringing. One tale notes of the inner struggle he might have felt upon seizing the clan from his brother, as he perhaps felt remorseful of the incident occurring, and was also bothered by how his character would be viewed by others, as he did not want to be seen as a usurper or unjust. Even in war, Kagetora sought to appear as perhaps more honorable than his many contemporaries. There is of course the famous story of Kagetora kindly sending salt to his eventual great rival Takeda Shingen, when Shingen's domain was cut off from salt. It was an act of kindness which also displayed Kagetora's true nature, and also spawned the famous saying of sending salt to one's enemy as a way of saying, play fair, especially when your opponent is disadvantaged. For Kagetora, however, this was likely more of a symbolic gesture of fairness, to show that he'd rather defeat Shingen honorably on the battlefield than by taking advantage of an unfortunate situation. If this is really true, then it certainly paints Kagetora as the real epitome of the valiant samurai that pop culture often wants us to believe that they were. However, what instead appears to be an increasing trend we can trace throughout his life is an adherence to his own ideal of justice, perhaps to the extent of being a form of divine retribution. And we can point to no clearer example of this than with his own identification with Bishamonten, a Buddhist god of war. It is strongly believed that Kagetora held an affinity to Bishamonten, with some even going so far as to say that he began to identify himself with the deity. He is even known to have adopted the character of Bi used at the start of the word Bishamonten as his own battle standard, This symbol, which I have seen some people mistake for being the Uesugi or Nagao Kamon, but in truth was merely Kagetora's own unique standard which he would carry into his battles, displaying that he had the will of heaven on his side. In 1553, Kagetora took a pilgrimage to Kyoto. It was here that he had an audience with both Emperor Gonara and Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru. It is thought that this could have been the first meeting between Kagetora and Yoshiteru, as another meeting would later occur in 1559. However, what is important to understand is the impression that they supposedly left on one another. Ashikaga Yoshiteru had great ambition. For generations, the influence of his family had declined, as other great powers around the capital had moved in to strong-arm the affairs of the government. Yoshiteru, wishing to break free from the grip of the mighty Miyoshi, sought to strengthen his position and restore the true power of the Muromachi Bakufu. This can obviously be argued as a just cause, to break free from the influence of those who were supposed to be beneath him and resurrect the authority which was vested within Yoshiteru. Stories suggest that Kagetora may have been heavily influenced by this meeting with the shogun, understanding his character and his own quest for justice. And Yoshiteru as well may have come to admire the passion of the young Kagetora, with whom he might have seen as a true champion of virtue. When Kagetora departed Kyoto to return home to Echigo, he did so renewed, with new vigor in his soul for the momentous task he had ahead of him. And what a task it would come to be. It was in this same year that Kagetora would be met with a new threat, that of the Takeda, who had been pushing deeper into Shinano, spurred forth by their own charismatic leader, Takeda Harunobu, better known later by his Buddhist name, Shingen. Harunobu stood poised to seize the majority of the province, with one of the last major holdouts being in the north, that of Murakami Yoshikyo, whose power base was Katsurao. Refusing to submit to Harunobu, intense fighting erupted between the Murakami and Takeda. Yet, faced with insurmountable odds, Yoshikyo was eventually left with no other choice other than to abandon his homeland and flee to the safety of another friendly lord. Where he found refuge would be with none other than Kagetora. The two would share similar aims. For one, Yoshikyo obviously desired to recapture Katsurao, yet for Kagetora, this was also a mission of security. He knew if left unchecked, that Takeda would soon be threatening Echigo. Thus, Kagetora was quick to back Yoshikyo and marched south to challenge the Takeda position. It would be here Kagetora would come to meet Harunobu on the battlefield for the first time, at a place known as Kawanakajima. This first battle, also known as the Battle of Fusei, was to be more of a skirmish than anything else, as Kagetora destroyed an advancing contingent of Harunobu's army. Yet, Harunobu himself, in face of the Nagao forces, settled into a defensive posture. Not willing to order an assault of a heavily entrenched enemy, and having made his presence known, Kagetora took his small victory and returned back to Echigo. The message had been sent. This was as far as Kagetora was willing to let the Takeda go, and soon enough, Harunobu had departed back for Kai. It would be 2 years before Kagetora would face Harunobu again. Yet, this first meeting between the two would set the stage for a continuing struggle which would grip their lives for many years to come. Harunobu was to be Kagetora's greatest nemesis, and Kawanakajima their legendary arena. By 1554, Japan would see the formation of one of the most significant alliances of the period. Orchestrated by the wise Imagawa monk Taigin Sesai, this was to be the Koso-sun Sangoku Dome, or the tripartite alliance of the Takeda, Hojo, and Imagawa. It was a massive threat in the region, as their combined efforts meant the freedom to expand outward in all directions. This sent the Takeda deeper into Shinano, the Go-Hojo further into the Kanto, and the Imagawa spreading throughout the Tokai. The situation before Kagetora would be challenging to even the greatest military leaders throughout world history. Not just how to deal with the Takeda or Hojo, but now with them allied at that. It would be a doom in which many lesser commanders would have buckled under. Yet Kagetora held firm, not just bracing for impact, but instead turning proactive against the many threats to his domain. Sallying forth to meet it head-on, as we saw with his first foray into Shinano, and as we know, there would soon be another. In the interim, Kagetora was made to deal with another rebellious vassal, that of Kitajo Takehiro, who had become a thorn in Kagetora's side on more than one occasion, despite putting down his revolt in 1555. What this helps to illustrate is a continuing contentious atmosphere surrounding Kagetora's leadership. There were still those who took issues with his command, or who fell into open disagreement with him. Yet Kagetora always found ways of dealing with these elements. One such story sees Kagetora threatening to abandon the clan to instead pursue the life of being a monk, only to then be chased down and begged to come back once his retainers had come to their senses. It was actions like these which helped to showcase his character and the lengths at which he was willing to go in order to make a point. Eventually, Kagetora would develop a loyal corps of 25 generals who would become increasingly famous through stories later during the Edo period. Figures such as Naoe Kagetsuna, the father of Kanetsugu, Kakizaki Kageye, Saito Tomonobu, Usami Saramitsu, and Nagao Masakage, just to say a few. But, like I said, not all of them were strongly united around Kagetora, and it would take time to prove himself to many of them, and for others, they needed to be put into check. Throughout 1555 and 1557, Kagetora would face off against Haranobu 2 more times at Kawanakajima, as the Takeda continued to expand their control in Shinano. Both battles came out to be little more than a war of maneuvers and skirmishes, but no real major engagements. It was becoming a staring match to see which side would blink first, yet neither would, and both times they would be forced to withdraw before any real action was seen. By 1559, Kagetora would return to Kyoto once more, with the intent of visiting a number of holy places and meeting yet again with the emperor, and perhaps more importantly, Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru. With Kagetora increasingly becoming a regional power in the east, it was Yoshiteru's hope that he would be able to gather the support of Kagetora and several other mighty eastern lords who would be willing to march west and drive the Miyoshi from the capital. Sadly, despite Kagetora likely being eager to be of service to the Bakufu, Yoshiteru's plans would never come to fruition, as each of the eastern lords were far too divided to ever work together on such a mission. Yoshiteru would go down as a tragic figure, as within 5 years, it would be the very enemies whom he sought to free himself from that would ultimately kill him. In the spring of 1560, Kagetora was on campaign again, this time in the Hokuriku, as he had embarked on a campaign against the quarrelsome Jinbo clan of Echu at the behest of the Shina family. Kagetora marched into Echu and seized a number of significant fortifications before withdrawing. As soon enough, another significant development would cause him to embark on a far greater campaign to the south. By June of 1560, the Imagawa clan were dealt a crippling blow at the Battle of Okehizama, when Oda Nobunaga succeeded in defeating their much larger enemy and slaying Daimyo Imagawa Yoshimoto. The great alliance of the Imagawa, Takeda, and Hojo was thrown into disarray at this course of events, and it would not be long before the old allies would soon turn on each other. Kagetora took advantage of this chaos and quickly launched a campaign against the Hojo, with his sights set on seizing the Hojo capital at Odawara. This would be perhaps the largest campaign Kagetora would embark on throughout his life, as not only did he lead a massive army of his own south against the Hojo, but also coordinated with a coalition of minor clans throughout the region who all banded together to strike at the Hojo in unison. Faced with threats from numerous directions, the Hojo were unable to withstand the initial rush of the Uesugi coalition's advance. Kagetora and his allied forces would seize Hojo strongholds all throughout Kotsuke and Musashi province as he marched to the Hojo capital. Hojo Ujiyasu had gathered his remaining forces and shut himself inside Odawara, forcing Kagetora to lay siege. Had Odawara fallen, and it would have meant the end of the Go-Hojo and a new reign for the Uesugi throughout the Kanto, as the Go-Hojo had largely achieved their position through crushing the weakened remnants of the old Uesugi houses. And one might expect that with Uesugi Norimasa working alongside Kagetora, that Kagetora sought to restore him to a position of prominence in the Kanto. Yet, something a bit different was set to happen. By 1561, perhaps by seeing the rise of Kagetora and how he had come to lead such a mighty force, Norimasa instead decided on another course of action. Perhaps it had been discussed prior, and perhaps it was something Kagetora wished to happen all along. But what is known is that by the spring of 1561, Uesugi Norimasa had both adopted Kagetora and transferred the title of Kanto Kanrei to him. Kagetora's line of the Nagao family would become the heirs to the Uesugi clan, and Kagetora would later change his own name to that of Masatora, taking the Masa from Norimasa's name. Thus, for a time, Nagao Kagetora would become known as Uesugi Masatora. All Masatora needed to do now was seize Odawara, wiping the Go-Hojo off the map and restoring Uesugi rule once more. Yet he would not be allowed to do so. In the north, capitalizing on Masatora's armies being away from Ichigo, Takeda Haranobu, who was now going by the name Shingen, began to mobilize his forces. Masatora was left with little choice than to abandon the siege of Odawara so that he could quickly return home to ward off the Takeda. By the fall of 1561, Masatora had led his army back to the Kawanakajima plain to yet again face off against his nemesis. Across from him, Takeda Shingen and his generals schemed on how to crush Masatora, eventually coming up with a plan to attempt to pincer the Uesugi army from two sides. Yet Masatora, through genius instinct, managed to outwit the Takeda, moving his forces before the plan commenced, and catching Shingen completely by surprise. Where all the prior battles of Kawanakajima had been merely small-scale skirmishes, this battle erupted into a massive clash, as Masatora slammed hard into the Takeda lines. With Shingen's forces currently split up, he was caught in disarray until the remainder of his army was able to link back together. Legend says that during the heat of the battle, Masatora personally led a charge against Shingen's headquarters, resulting in one of the most epic moments in the entire Sengoku period, if it actually happened. As Masatora rode in slashing wildly at Shingen, who was left to only defend himself with his war fan. This would be the only time both men would ever meet face to face. Yet eventually, Masatora was forced to pull back, and as the remainder of the Takeda army began to arrive, he would ultimately order his forces to withdraw. Thousands were dead on both sides, including a number of senior Takeda commanders who had been slain during Masatora's initial onslaught. Ultimately, although the Takeda were able to force Masatora from the field, the larger result of the battle would be inconclusive, as both forces would be made to retreat back to their home provinces once more. In terms of the legend of Masatora leading his charge, it may not be so impossible to believe, as it is noted that in a collection of swords owned by Masatora, some show signs of chipping along the blade, evidence of Masatora perhaps using them in battle. Following the fourth battle of Kawanakajima, Masatora returned his attention back to the Kanto, and in 1562, just a year after changing his name to Masatora, he would change it yet again. This time, he had been granted the character of Teru from the name of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru. Thus, he now became Uesugi Terutora. The next several years saw him battling all across the east, from Echu to the Kanto, to even defending Echigo from an attack by the Ashina. Terutora was constantly at war. And although for a time he was able to maintain his position in the Kanto, eventually he was unable to hold out against both attacks from the Hojo and Takeda. Still, Terutora was able to safeguard his prominent position in the Hokuriku, and even faced off against Shingen at yet another battle at Kawanakajima, which took a form similar to that of the first several battles, amounting to little more than a staring contest. In all things, Shingen remained Terutora's greatest obstacle, not just physically, as the Takeda clan remained a dominant force in the region, but also Shingen's influence, which continued to meddle in regional affairs, causing various minor lords to turn against the Uesugi in support of the Takeda. Terutora knew he needed to break the deadlock, and the one way which seemed the most destined for success was to broker an alliance with one of his greatest enemies. After the fall of the Koso-sun Sengoku Dome, the Hojo and the Takeda were no longer allies. Thus, Terutora aimed to shake up the system further, reaching out to his old foe, Hojo Ujiyasu, with the prospect of joining their clans together. The offer was not just beneficial to the Uesugi, but also the Hojo. At this time, Ujiyasu was feeling pressure from multiple directions as well. Making an ally out of the Uesugi had the prospect of turning the situation around. Thus, by 1569, an alliance between the Uesugi and the Hojo was negotiated. And a year later, in 1570, Terutora received the young son of Hojo Ujiyasu as a political hostage. His name was Hojo Saburo, yet, in time, Terutora is known to have taken a great liking to him, and was eventually adopted by Terutora. Now, at this time, Terutora already had one adopted son, this being Uesugi Kagekatsu, who had been originally a son of Nagao Masakage. The adoption of Saburo put him immediately at odds with Kagekatsu, as now a question began to emerge as to who was going to be named Terutora's successor. What made things more awkward was when Terutora bestowed upon Saburo his old name of Kagetora. Thus, Hojo Saburo became Uesugi Kagetora. Obviously, this whole matter of succession could have been solved if Kenshin had any real children of his own, but as we know, he did not. Stories like to theorize that Terutora's intense spirituality caused him to remain rather chaste throughout his life. Yet these stories may be exaggerations, as there are several records which discuss various love affairs he had with different women. There is also the modern-day myth that he himself was maybe a woman, but this is complete speculation with nothing concrete historically to back it up whatsoever. And although we'll likely never know the full truth about his relationship status and sexuality perhaps, it does add another interesting detail to the puzzle that was Terutora. But in regards to how spirituality may have impacted his life, it would be around this point in time that he would finally commit to religion more so than he had ever done before, taking on the teachings of a monk and embracing a religious identity. Finally, he claimed the Buddhist name, Kenshin. It doesn't appear to be completely known when this event occurred, but that it was likely within the 1570s. In 1571, Hojo Ujiyasu passed away, and 2 years later, Takeda Shingen did as well. It is said that Kenshin lamented publicly over the death of Shingen, despite the two being such bitter rivals. Perhaps Kenshin had just come to realize what it meant to lose someone so influential, not just within the country, but within his own life. He would never know a greater opponent, and just like that, Kenshin was now alone in the East, as the great titans of his age had now passed. The alliance he had forged with the Hojo came to an end, and he was once again thrust into conflict on multiple fronts. In the West, the Oda were coming into power, as through Oda Nobunaga's domination of the capital and great authority he amassed, he stood poised to seize the country. A new puppet Ashikaga Shogun had been installed under Oda control, and then later removed, ending the over 2-century reign of the Muromachi Bakufu. For a brief moment, Kenshin had come to work with Nobunaga, as their aims aligned, both warring against the Takeda. Nobunaga, in recognition of Kenshin's status, even sent him a famous screen which depicted a scene of Kyoto. Such a stunning work of art shows the respect with which Nobunaga viewed Kenshin. Yet the Uesugi-Oda alliance as well was not to last forever, and after the death of Shingen, it would only be several years before the two became hostile with one another. Kenshin had now emerged as perhaps the Oda's last greatest threat in the East, especially after the Takeda's devastating defeat at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, which sent Takeda Katsuyori reeling, losing a massive portion of his army and many of his senior commanders. It was a decisive blow that Takeda would never recover from. By the late 1570s, Kenshin had expanded his control of the Hokuriku up through Echu and Noto. He had warred against various local lords and was additionally forced to contend with numerous uprisings of the Ikoiki who were rampant throughout nearby Kaga province. However, the Oda armies were too marching up through the Hokuriku, and it was only a matter of time before both sides would clash. In 1577, the Uesugi and Oda armies would finally come to blows at the Battle of Tedorigawa. This would go down in history as Uesugi Kenshin's final triumph. It was here an Oda army under the command of Shibata Katsuie marched against the Uesugi in Kaga. Yet Kenshin, who had secured various strongholds throughout the area, held a superior position. Legend says that in order to goad the Oda into attacking directly, Kenshin split his forces as to appear weaker, causing Katsuie to order his troops across the Tedori River to take the fight to the Uesugi. It was then, however, as they began to clash with the Uesugi on the opposite bank, that Kenshin released floodgates, causing incoming tides to carry away scores of attackers, with the remainder being trapped by the Uesugi lines. Katsuie would order a full withdrawal, yet Kenshin's forces pursued and inflicted a massive number of casualties on the remaining Oda forces. It was a glorious achievement for Kenshin, and a devastating defeat for the Oda that may have sent Nobunaga into a state of shock and fear that Kenshin may soon threaten the central region. There was no other living daimyo who measured up to the Dragon of Echigo, the god of war. And if Kenshin would have continued to push west, he may have brought the reckoning of heaven down upon the Oda. However, Kenshin did not, and instead he pulled back into Echigo following this great victory. One story, likely highly embellished, suggests that Kenshin sent word to Nobunaga following the clash at Tedorigawa, requesting to meet the Oda in battle again the following year if they were man enough to face him. In his letter, he supposedly said, "Shingen is already dead. That you, sir, leave Takeda Katsuyori to Ieyasu while yourself staying in Azuchi must mean that you are making preparations against me. You've had easy fights with your enemies in the Kyoto region. You have yet to observe a northerner's skills. With your permission, sir, I'd like to come west to meet you with soldiers from the 8 provinces next spring, on the 15th day of the 3rd month. Try, sir, not to regard me, Kenshin, the way you do the leather-sandaled city folk." Such clear and obvious taunting would not have been enough to provoke Nobunaga, though if true, it certainly may have enraged him. Kenshin likely had no intention of marching back west at this time, as it appears his next campaign, which he was planning, was once again to resume his operations in the Kanto, now with the Oda warded off and the Takeda severely weakened. Perhaps now, with little threats to his position, he may finally take what he believed rightfully belonged to him. Yet, this was not meant to be. In the spring of 1578, Kenshin suddenly became severely ill. There are numerous theories as to what ailment had taken hold of him, from a stroke to perhaps cancer induced by his notable love of alcohol. Regardless, Kenshin began to realize the end was near and wrote a final poem. Throughout his life, Kenshin had become quite the prominent poet, a fact of his life seldom explored. Yet it appears that through this dedication to the art, he was able to mingle with court nobles during his time spent in the capital, calling forth his skills as an accomplished poet to win their praise. Now nearing death, he would write, "Even a lifelong prosperity is but one cup of sake. A life of 49 years is passed in a dream. I know not what life is, nor death. Year in, year out, all but a dream. Both heaven and hell are left behind. I stand in the moonlit dawn, free from clouds of attachment. On April 19th, 1578, Uesugi Kenshin died. Immediately following his death, having not properly designated an heir, the Uesugi clan fell into turmoil as his two adopted sons, Kagekatsu and Kagetora, clashed over who was to seize control. And although it would be Kagekatsu who would win the struggle known as the Otate no Ran, the Uesugi would never be the same. Kenshin's life was a life of war. Throughout his nearly 50 years, he was almost constantly on campaign, not too dissimilar to many of his contemporaries, yet what separates Kenshin from the rest were his aims. Where so many other daimyo warred for personal gain, regional dominance, and expanding influence, Kenshin warred for what appears to be a different purpose. He fought to safeguard Echigo. He resisted the threats of the Takeda. He invaded the Kanto to restore the Uesugi rule of old. He secured much of the Hokuriku, crushing eco uprisings and eventually sending Oda forces reeling. Kenshin warred for justice and security. He sought to establish a new age for the Uesugi as proud servants of the Muramachi Bakufu. In doing so, he became one of the most feared and respected names of his age, and in my own opinion, the greatest military commander of the Sengoku period. Had he lived another 30 years, only God knows what Kenshin could have achieved. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.